A woman's scream pierced the midnight forest, raw as a wound torn open. Was she running from a monster or hunting one to its grave? Smoke twisted over the ridge, black and thick against a sky bleeding crimson, like the world itself was wounded. Thomas, a solitary wanderer with scars that told tales of betrayal and loss, crouched low in the underbrush, his hand steady on the worn hilt of his knife. The deer he'd been stalking had bolted, its hoofbeats swallowed by the night, spooked by something far deadlier than a hunter's arrow. He smelled it before he saw it. Blood, sharp and metallic, mingled with the acrid sting of burnt canvas and the sour tang of fear. Trouble was near, and Thomas had walked with trouble too long to turn away. His moccasins glided over pine needles, silent as a whisper, his breath slow and controlled, a skill honed through years of survival. The forest was unnaturally still. No birds called, no wind rustled the leaves, only the distant crackle of flames and a faint, furious sob carried on the air, like a heartbeat struggling to hold on. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the shadows, narrowing as he reached the ridge's crest. Below, devastation sprawled across a clearing. A camp reduced to ruin, tents slashed open like gutted beasts, a cart smoldering, its wooden frame charred and splintered. 3 horses lay dead, their bodies torn by blades, their eyes glassy with terror. 6 men's bodies littered the ground, faces frozen in shock, throats cut clean, hands clutching dirt as if they could hold onto life. By the creek, tied to a shattered cartwheel, was a young woman. Her wedding dress, once a pristine white, was now a tattered map of mud and blood, her face bruised, her blonde hair matted with ash. But her eyes, they burned with a fire that wasn't fear. It was defiance, raw and unyielding. Was she a victim caught in a trap, or a warrior biding her time, waiting for a moment? Thomas stepped closer, his shadow falling across her like a cloak. Her emerald eyes snapped open, blazing with rage and resolve, locking onto him with an intensity that could cut stone. She tried to scream, but her voice was raw, spent from pain or fury, reduced to a hoarse croak. "I'm not one of them," he said, his voice low, steady as the earth beneath them. She stared at his knife, its blade glinting in the firelight, then at his face, dark hair tied in a braid, skin weathered by years of sun and sorrow, clothes patched and worn, a mix of leather and homespun from a life caught between worlds. He saw her strength, not her wounds, her spirit unbroken despite the blood and bruises. He pulled a canteen from his satchel and offered water, holding it carefully to her cracked lips. She drank greedily, coughing, water spilling down her chin, her hands trembling as she reached for more. "Thank you," she rasped, her voice like gravel scraped raw. He drew his knife and cut the ropes binding her wrists and ankles, careful not to graze her skin. She gasped, clutching her side, pain twisting her features, her breath hitching. "Ribs," he said, his eyes scanning her for other injuries. "Broken, maybe worse. We can't stay here." "Who are you?" she demanded, her gaze piercing, searching for lies or weakness. "Thomas," he said simply. "That's enough for now." She nodded, wary but desperate, her body trembling from pain, cold, or the weight of whatever she was running from. Survival didn't care about trust. It demanded action, and she knew it. He lifted her gently, her weight light as a fallen leaf, her head resting against his chest, her matted hair brushing his neck. Her gown reeked of smoke and blood. A bride's dress, now a shroud of betrayal, its lace torn, its hem stained with the earth she'd fled across. Why was she running? Who had she defied to end up here, tied and bleeding? The sun sank, casting long, blood-orange shadows across the plains, the sky fading to a bruised purple. Thomas's camp hid deep in the forest. A crude shelter of pine branches propped against a moss-covered boulder, a fire pit ringed with smooth river stones, a testament to his solitary life. He laid her on a bed of furs, soft and worn, and sparked a flame, the firelight flickering like a wary sentinel, casting shadows that danced on the trees. She watched him, her fear fading, curiosity creeping into her eyes like the first light of dawn. "Your name?" he asked, tossing kindling onto the fire, the flames catching with a soft hiss. "Annabelle," she said, her voice tight, guarded as a locked gate, as if giving her name was a risk. He handed her a strip of dried venison, tough but nourishing. She tore into it, hunger outweighing pride, her hands shaking as she ate, her eyes never leaving him. He set a small iron pot over the flames, adding wild onions, squirrel meat, and a handful of roots he'd dug from the earth earlier that day, their earthy scent mingling with the smoke. "How long was I out there?" she asked, staring into the fire as if it held the answers to her pain. "Hours, maybe a day. They hit your camp hard, like a storm that leaves nothing behind." Her jaw clenched, her eyes unblinking, reflecting the flames like twin embers. "They were my people," she said, her voice low, bitter. "They were James's men, sent to drag me back." Thomas's hand paused over the pot, his eyes narrowing, a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "Back to what?" Her voice turned to ice, sharp and unyielding. "A marriage I didn't choose. James killed my brother, Marcus, to force my hand. I ran on my wedding night, veil and all. I swore I'd see him dead before I wear his ring." Her words were a vow, etched in pain and fury, her hands balling into fists, her knuckles white. Was she a grieving sister seeking justice, or a woman hiding darker secrets, driven by more than revenge? Thomas stirred the stew, his face a mask, his thoughts churning like a river after rain. A murderer's bride? A sister turned avenger? The silence grew thick, broken only by the fire's hiss and the distant call of a night bird, its cry lonely in the dark. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice softer now, probing for truth. "You were tied up, bleeding, left to die. That's reason enough for me." She frowned, studying him like a map to a hidden truth, her eyes tracing the lines of his face. "You talk like you've seen too much, carried too many ghosts." He smirked, faint but real, a crack in his stoic armor. "Raised by two worlds. One wore moccasins, lived by the land. The other wore boots, called each other sir, and built walls. Neither wanted me. I learned to survive alone between them." Annabelle shifted, wincing as her ribs protested, her breath catching. "That sounds like a lonely life," she said, her voice tinged with understanding. "It's the only one that kept me breathing," he replied, his tone flat but honest. The firelight carved their faces, Thomas's sharp cheekbones, shadowed by years of loss and survival. Annabelle's bruised beauty, fierce despite her pain, her eyes alive with a fire that refused to fade. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if speaking it might summon them. "Men like that, they hunt until they win, or until they're buried." His tone carried weight, a hint of something unspoken, as if he'd faced men like these before, knew their kind too well. What was he hiding? What did he know about James's men? She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under like a tide. "If I don't wake, thank you," she murmured, her voice fading. "You'll wake," he said, certain as the stars above, his voice a quiet anchor. He sat up, his knife across his lap, watching the constellations spin in the cold, brilliant sky, their light sharp and unyielding. Annabelle slept in broken intervals, muttering Marcus and James in her dreams, her hands twitching as if reaching for a ghost or a weapon. Was Marcus her anchor, her reason to fight? Was James her enemy? Or something more, a shadow she couldn't escape? Dawn broke, the horizon clear of smoke, the prairie stretching wide like a golden sea under the rising sun, its light warm but unforgiving. Annabelle stirred, blinking up at Thomas, her eyes heavy with pain, but sharp with resolve. "You didn't sleep," she said, her voice hoarse. He nodded, his eyes scanning the trees, alert for any sign of pursuit. Didn't trust the dark. Her fear softened, a flicker of trust taking root, fragile but real. "Where now?" she asked, pushing herself up, wincing as her ribs screamed. "Somewhere James can't find you," he said, his voice firm. She gripped a walking stick he'd carved, its wood smooth under her calloused hands, her fingers tracing its grain. "You mean us," she said, her eyes meeting his, challenging him to deny it. He didn't answer, but his silence was agreement, a vow unspoken. They moved into the forest, Annabelle limping, her pain a constant shadow, Thomas scanning every branch and shadow for threats, his senses honed by years of living on the edge. What was he searching for? Had he faced men like James before? Or was there something personal driving him? The forest was merciless. Roots tore Annabelle's dress to rags. Thorns scratched her arms, and every step stabbed her ribs, but she pressed on, fueled by her brother's memory. Thomas moved like part of the wild, reading signs she couldn't, tracks, broken twigs, shifts in the wind. He paused often, listening to sounds beyond her hearing. Once, he gently pushed her down as a rider passed, rifle glinting, horse scarred. One of James's men? Annabelle gripped the knife Thomas had given her, its weight steadying. When the rider disappeared, Thomas stood. "Not ours," he said quietly, the words strange and heavy. Did he have allies? Hidden enemies? Was he more than just a guide, or also running from something? By noon, they reached a shallow stream, its water cold and clear as glass, cutting through the forest like a silver ribbon. Thomas knelt, dipping his fingers, tasting the water to check its safety. "We cross," he said, his voice flat, decisive. Annabelle glared, leaning on her stick, her dress heavy with mud. "You ever ask?" she snapped, her pain sharpening her tone. He looked at her, his expression deadpan, a faint spark of humor in his eyes. Would change the answer? She huffed, her lips twitching despite herself, and waded in, gasping as the icy water bit her legs, soaking her tattered gown. She stumbled, her foot catching on a hidden rock, and Thomas caught her arm, his grip steady as stone, pulling her upright before she could fall. On the far bank, he built a fire with practiced speed, using pine bark and dry moss, the flames catching quickly, their warmth a small mercy. Annabelle hugged her knees, shivering, watching him work with a precision that spoke of years alone, years of relying on no one but himself. "How do you know all this?" she asked, her voice softer now, curious despite her pain. "Grew up needing to," he said, his tone clipped but honest. No one else was there. Her eyes met his, searching for more. "Your family." He paused, his hands stilling over the fire, his voice low, heavy with memory. "Mother died when I was 10, taken by fever. Father's people, his tribe, turned their backs when I was born, called me half-blood, unworthy. The wild was my teacher, my home." They sat in silence by the fire, its warmth steady, Annabelle twisting bark in accord with Thomas's quiet guidance, their fingers brushing as they worked. The silence felt like connection, not distance, a fragile trust forming. By dusk, they found a crumbling shack with a rusted horseshoe above the door. "Homie," Annabelle muttered, hiding her exhaustion. Thomas gave the faintest smile. They camped there, Annabelle staring at the fiery sunset, haunted by Marcus's laugh, James's smirk, blood, and the night she ran from her wedding. Then Thomas spoke, voice low. "You dream of him." She nodded, tears close. "My sister," he said, eyes distant, "taken when our village burned. I tracked her for weeks. Found bones by a stream." Annabelle's heart ached. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So was I," he said. "It didn't bring her back." She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper, raw with truth. "They called people like you monsters, savages. Then I met you. Monsters don't save strangers, carry them through forests, or make squirrels stew. His brow twitched, a spark of humor in his eyes, softening the hard lines of his face. You call my stew bad? She grinned, the sound startling them both. A brief light in the dark, a moment of connection in a world of loss. Rest, he said, his voice firm but kind, a quiet command. We move at dawn. Annabelle settled on a bedroll, staring at the stars through the shack's broken roof, their light cold and distant. An owl hooted, its call lonely, echoing her own heart. A wolf howled far off, its voice wild and free, a reminder of the world beyond her pain. Then a twig snapped sharp and close. She froze, her heart racing. Thomas was up, bow in hand, signaling silence with a raised hand. Voices came, rough and close, followed by low, cruel laughter. 4, Thomas whispered, his breath barely audible, his eyes sharp in the dark. James's scouts. Annabelle's stomach knotted, her hand tightening on the knife at her belt. Had her enemy found her already? Was James himself out there, waiting? Thomas slipped into the dark, a shadow among shadows, his form vanishing into the trees. Annabelle waited, her hand on the knife, every sound amplified. The rustle of leaves, the creak of branches, the faint drip of water from the shack's roof. A shout broke the silence, sudden and harsh, followed by grunts, the dull thud of bodies hitting earth, a gunshot. Another, the sound echoing through the forest. Silence returned, heavy and ominous, pressing against her chest. Thomas appeared, blood on his sleeve. Not his face hard, unreadable, his bow still in hand. They were hunting you, he said, his voice low, edged with something like anger. Annabelle's hand shook, guilt clawing at her, the weight of his sacrifice heavy. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. He sat beside her, close but not touching, his presence a steady anchor. Don't be. I've killed for less, for worse reasons. She saw a graze on his ribs, shallow but red, blood seeping through his shirt, a fresh wound among older scars. You're hurt, she said, her voice trembling. She cleaned it with a damp cloth, her hands shaking, their faces inches apart, his breath warm, smelling of pine and raw earth. Why do you keep helping me? She asked, her voice raw, needing an answer, needing to understand. The wild doesn't abandon the wounded, he said, his eyes meeting hers, steady and true. Neither do I. The next day, the forest thickened, shadows deepening under a heavy canopy. Annabelle moved slower, ribs aching, but her resolve burned. Marcus's memory pushing her forward, her vow to make James pay unshaken. Thomas taught her to read tracks, twigs snapped, boot prints in mud. James's men are close, he said, pointing to sharp hoof prints. They're circling. How'd he know? Experience? Or something personal? In a clearing, they found a camp, burnt bones, a torn glove, and ash. Annabelle froze. Marcus's, she whispered, tracing it. He wore this the day James killed him. Grief and fury tightened her chest. Thomas studied the dirt. They're heading west, toward the plains. We follow. But why was he risking so much for her? By midday, the trees gave way to a sun-scorched plain, where heat shimmered and a ghost town lay between jagged hills. Faded and broken, Iron Hollow stood with its rusted windmill and rotting wood. Thomas slowed, scanning every shadow. We rest here, he said quietly. Annabelle clutched Marcus's glove, her throat dry. You know this place? She asked. Lived here once, he replied, voice heavy. Bad memories. They entered cautiously, Annabelle limping, Thomas silent, his bow on his back. A saloon sign read, no dogs, no outcasts, carve in hate. Annabelle flinched, Thomas didn't react. Inside, dust-covered broken furniture, a ruined piano, and a cracked mirror. My mother's room, Thomas murmured, pointing to the corner. She sang here. serve men who hated her. They turned on her. She told me to run through broken glass and not look back. Annabelle whispered she didn't make it. Thomas stared at the mirror. She gave them what they wanted so I could escape. Hooves echoed in the canyon, faint but growing louder, a steady drumbeat of approaching danger. Thomas froze, his hand on his bow, his body tense as a drawn string. "Stay here," he whispered, slipping outside like a shadow, his form blending with the dusk. Annabelle peered through a crack in the wall, her heart pounding, her fingers tightening on Marcus's glove. 5 riders emerged from the dust, rough men with hard eyes, their faces marked by greed and violence, one cradling a shotgun, its barrel glinting. The leader dismounted, boots crunching gravel, a cruel grin splitting his face, his voice sharp and mocking. "Thomas, been a damn long time, brother." Annabelle's breath caught, her heart stopping. Thomas stepped forward, shoulders squared, his voice low and dangerous, a blade wrapped in calm. "Samuel, didn't expect you here." Samuel laughed, slow and venomous, his eyes glinting with malice. "Heard about a runaway bride. James pays good coin for her head. Says she's got blood on her soul, maybe more than him. Says she's dangerous." Annabelle's blood ran cold, her mind racing. Dangerous how? What lies had James spread about her, and why? "You led those men after her," Thomas said, his voice a blade, cutting through the tension. Samuel shrugged, careless, his shotgun resting on his shoulder. "Money's money, brother. She's trouble, and James wants her back. Dead or alive, don't much care which." Annabelle stumbled out, her voice shaking but sharp, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You're his brother?" Samuel's grin was predatory, his eyes raking over her, sizing her up like prey. "Ain't she a firebrand? Worth every penny James is offering." Thomas growled, stepping closer, his hand twitching toward his knife. "Leave her." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his shotgun twitching, his voice cold as winter. "You rode with me, Thomas. Raided towns, burned homes, spilled blood for coin or spite. Now you're playing hero for a killer's bride." Annabelle stared at Thomas, her heart sinking, her world tilting. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice trembling with betrayal. He met her gaze, unflinching, his voice steady, heavy with shame. "Yes, I was that man years ago. I left that life, chose different. I'm not him anymore." Samuel laughed, bitter and mocking, his voice dripping with scorn. "You taught me to move silent, to slit throats without a sound, to take what we wanted. You don't get to wash your hands now, brother, not after all we did." Annabelle's world spun, the ground unsteady beneath her, her trust in Thomas fraying like her tattered dress. He'd been like them, a raider, a killer, a man who'd burn lives like hers. Samuel raised his shotgun, his voice cold, final. "I came for her. Step aside. We're dead too." Thomas moved in front of Annabelle, his body a shield, his voice low and lethal. "She's not yours to take." Samuel stepped back, his grin twisting, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "One day, then I'm back with James and a whole crew. Run, or this hollow burns to ash, and you with it." The riders vanished into the dust, their hoofbeats fading like a storm's echo, leaving a silence that pressed against Annabelle's chest. She trembled, her voice sharp with betrayal, her eyes burning into Thomas. "You were like him. You raided, killed, destroyed lives." "I was," he said, his voice tight, heavy with shame, his eyes meeting hers, raw and honest. "I chose different. I've been running from that man ever since, trying to be something else." She sank to the floor, clutching Marcus's glove, staring at her fractured reflection in the mirror, her face a map of doubt and pain. Had she trusted the wrong man? Was Thomas her savior, or just another ghost from a past she couldn't escape? That night, they barely spoke, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. Annabelle sat by the fire, arms wrapped tight around herself, Marcus's glove pressed her chest, its leather worn from her brother's hands. Thomas cleaned his weapons, knife, bow, a revolver he'd found in the shack. His movements slow, deliberate, a ritual to keep his demons at bay, his face shadowed by the firelight. Finally, she spoke, her voice low, raw, cutting through the silence. "You left him once. You can leave again. I'm not running," he said, his eyes meeting hers, fierce with resolve, a fire of his own burning within. "Not this time. Not from you. Not from this fight." Her eyes glistened, her voice trembling but firm, fueled by her brother's memory. "Then we fight. For Marcus. For me. For whatever's left of us." He nodded, a silent vow, his hand tightening on his knife. "We fight." Far down the trail, hooves whispered in the dark, a promise of blood and reckoning. The next morning, they scouted Iron Hollow's edges, mapping every alley, every rooftop, every crumbling wall, their footsteps muffled by dust and decay. Annabelle's ribs ached, her breath shallow, her body protesting every move, but she pushed through, learning to load Thomas's spare revolver with shaking hands, her fingers fumbling but determined. "Aim steady," he said, adjusting her grip, his touch brief but grounding, his voice calm but firm. "Breathe out, then fire. Don't think, just do." She nodded, her resolve iron, her fear buried deep, her brother's face in her mind. Why was she so determined? Was it just vengeance for Marcus, or a need to reclaim herself, to prove she was more than James's prey? By midday, they found a hidden cache in the saloon's cellar. Rusted rifles, a box of bullets, a tattered map marked with James's routes, its edges frayed, its ink smudged but legible. "He's been through here," Thomas said, tracing the lines with a calloused finger, his voice low, urgent. "He's close, maybe a day away, maybe less." Annabelle's heart raced, her fingers tightening on Marcus's glove, her pulse a drumbeat of fear and anticipation. How close was her brother's killer? Would she face him today, tomorrow, or in a moment she couldn't predict? Dusk brought a storm, clouds bruising the sky, thunder rumbling like a warning from the heavens. They took shelter in the saloon, rain drumming the broken roof, leaking in cold rivulets that pooled on the floor. Annabelle sat by a shattered window, watching the horizon, Marcus's glove in her lap, its leather a tether to her brother's memory. "Why does James want me so bad?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm, her eyes searching the rain for answers. Thomas hesitated, his eyes distant, his hands still as he sat across from her. "Men like him don't lose what they claim," he said, his voice low, heavy with truth. "You ran, defied him, humiliated him. That's a wound to his pride, deeper than any knife. But it's more than that." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, steady and searching. "He killed Marcus to break you, to make you his body and soul. He wants you broken, chained to him, a trophy of his power." She shook her head, her voice breaking, tears burning her eyes. "He'll never have me. Marcus died to keep me free, to give me a chance to fight. I won't let that be for nothing." Thomas looked at her, something like respect flickering in his eyes, a recognition of her strength. "You're not broken, Annabelle," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "You're a storm he can't tame, a fire he can't put out." Her throat tightened, her heart aching with the weight of his words, with the possibility that she could be more than her pain, more than her vengeance. The storm passed, leaving silence and the scent of wet earth. Thomas stood watch, rifle in hand, eyes sharp in the moonlight. Annabelle dreamed. Marcus's voice, James's knife, her veil torn as she fled into the night. A sudden shout jolted her awake. Thomas was at the door, bow drawn. "They're here," he whispered. She grabbed the revolver, heart pounding, fear tight in her chest, but hands steady. Were Samuel and James both out there? Dawn broke cold over Iron Hollow, the ruined town bracing for blood. On a hill, Thomas stood ready. Annabelle checked her gun, pain fading beneath purpose. The scare bride was gone. In her place stood a woman shaped by loss, ready for vengeance. "They'll come from the south," Thomas said, his voice low, certain, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Samuel circles first, likes to watch, to savor the hunt. James will follow, bold and sure, his pride his weakness." Annabelle's voice was soft but unyielding, her eyes locked on the dust rising in the distance. "Are you ready to kill your brother?" He didn't answer, his silence heavy with unspoken pain, his jaw tight, his hand steady but his heart a storm. They took positions. Annabelle behind a broken stall near the general store, its wood splintered, its shelves empty. Thomas on the saloon roof, his bow within reach, his rifle steady, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. The town held its breath, its crumbling buildings like sentinels of a forgotten past, its alleys filled with dust and shadows. A hawk circled above, its cry piercing, then vanished into the clouds, as if fleeing what was to come. Then they came. 12 riders, more than expected, their horses kicking up clouds of dust, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. Samuel led, his face hidden behind a cloth mask, his knife spinning lazily in his hand, a predator playing with his prey. Behind him rode James, tall, scar-faced, his eyes cold as a snake's, a revolver in each hand, his presence radiating menace, his scar twisting with every word. Annabelle's blood froze, her fingers tightening on her gun, her heart a furnace of rage and grief. Her brother's killer, here, in the flesh, the man who'd taken Marcus, who'd tried to chain her soul. "Thomas," Samuel called, his voice mocking, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Bring her out, brother. Let's end this." Thomas stood, his rifle steady, his voice like iron, unyielding. "You brought too many, Samuel. You always did." James dismounted, his smirk twisting his scar, his voice smooth but deadly, dripping with arrogance. "Not enough to claim what's mine. Annabelle belongs to me, body and soul. She'll earn her place." A shot rang out, too eager, splintering the saloon's upper window in a burst of wooden glass, the sound shattering the tense quiet. Thomas fired, his bullet finding its mark, and a rider fell, his horse bolting, his body limp in the dust. Chaos erupted, dust and gunfire swallowing the town, the air thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Annabelle shot from cover, her bullet tearing through a man's leg, her aim steady despite her racing heart. He screamed, tumbling into the dirt, clutching his wound. Another charged her position, firing wild, his shots kicking up dust around her, one grazing her arm, a sharp sting of pain. Thomas's arrow struck him down, piercing his chest, silent and clean, his body crumpling without a sound. Annabelle's gun clicked empty, the sound a jolt of panic. She ducked behind a stall, reloading with shaking hands, her breath coming hard, her mind racing. She thought of Marcus's laugh, his hands steadying her as a child, James's knife flashing, the blood pooling under her brother's body, the moment she'd sworn to make him pay. She stood, fired, and another man crumpled, clutching his side, his eyes wide with shock. Only 8 remained. Samuel, James, and 6 others, their faces hardened by greed and violence, their weapons gleaming in the harsh light. James advanced, his revolvers gleaming, his voice like ice cutting through the chaos. "Annabelle, you can't run forever. You're mine, and you'll break." She stepped out, her gun raised, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her, her eyes locked on his. "You killed Marcus," she said, her voice a vow, a blade of its own. "I'll die before I'm yours." Samuel laughed, cruel and loud, his voice echoing off the buildings. "She's got fire, James. Shame she's marked for death." Thomas dropped to the street, blood soaking his shirt from a graze, but his stance was unyielding, his knife in one hand, his rifle in the other. "This ends here," he said, his voice a promise, a reckoning. Samuel grinned, his knife catching the light, his eyes glinting with malice. "Remember the creek, brother? We killed that bear together, looked it in the eye, ended it clean." Thomas's knife gleamed in his hand, his voice low and lethal, a storm ready to break. "I remember. Do it." Samuel fired a shotgun, the blast tearing through the air, a roar of destruction. Thomas rolled, the shot grazing his shoulder, blood blooming red, soaking his sleeve. He tackled Samuel, and they hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and fury, brothers bound by blood, torn apart by choice, their fight a clash of past and present. Annabelle faced James, her gun steady, her heart a furnace of rage, her brother's memory a fire that wouldn't die. "For Marcus," she growled, her voice a vow, her finger tightening on the trigger. James lunged, faster than she expected, his strength a wall, knocking her gun from her hand with a brutal swipe. They grappled, his hands crushing, his scar twisting as he sneered, his voice a hiss. "You'll break, just like your brother, just like everyone who defies me." Thomas pinned Samuel, his blade pressed to his brother's throat, blood dripping from both of them, their breaths ragged. Samuel grinned, blood on his teeth, his voice a taunt, defiant to the end. "Do it, Thomas. Be the man you were, the killer I made you." Annabelle screamed, "Thomas." James had her pinned, his knife at her throat, his breath hot against her face, his eyes alight with triumph. Thomas threw his knife, the blade sinking into James's shoulder, a clean, deadly strike. James staggered, his grip loosening, his knife falling to the dust, his face twisting in pain and shock. Annabelle scrambled for her gun, her fingers closing around its cold metal, her heart pounding. She fired, the shot tearing through James's heart, a single, perfect hit. He gasped, his eyes wide with shock, his body crumpling to the dust, blood pooling like it had under Marcus, a mirror of the past now avenged. Samuel reached for a hidden pistol, his grin fading, his hand shaking with desperation. Thomas drove his blade into Samuel's chest, the light leaving his brother's eyes, his body going still. Silence fell, heavy as a shroud, the air thick with dust, blood, and the weight of what they'd done. The last riders spurred their horses and fled, their hoofbeats fading into the wind, leaving only the dead and the living to face the aftermath. Annabelle's gun shook in her hand, her voice breaking, tears streaming down her face. "Marcus is avenged," she whispered, her heart raw, her soul lighter, the chains of her past falling away. Thomas touched her shoulder, his voice soft but firm, grounding her. "It's over." She fell against him, sobbing, the weight of her vengeance lifting, leaving her raw but free, her brother's memory a light in the dark. The wind swept the street clean, carrying away smoke, blood, and the echoes of gunfire, leaving only the promise of a new dawn. They buried James and Samuel beneath the canyon's edge, where wild grass swayed in the breeze, its green a stark contrast to the blood-soaked earth. No crosses, no stones, just earth to cover the sins of the past, to let the land reclaim what it could. That night, by a fire built from the saloon's broken beams, Annabelle tended Thomas's wounds, her hands steady despite the ache in her own body, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the blood from his skin. "I was chained," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, raw with truth. "Marcus's death, James's hands, they trapped me, held me in a cage of grief and fear. I'm free now, because of you, because I kept my promise to my brother." Thomas met her eyes, his own carrying the weight of years, loss, shame, and now something like hope, a spark that hadn't been there before. "You freed yourself, Annabelle," he said, his voice quiet but certain, his eyes holding hers. "I just walked beside you, carried you when you couldn't stand." She looked at him, really looked, seeing the man who'd chosen her over his blood, who'd fought for her when she had nothing left, who'd seen her not as a broken bride, but as a storm, a fire, a woman worth fighting for. "What now?" she asked, her voice trembling with possibility, with the weight of a future she could barely imagine. He stared into the flames, his voice quiet but certain, a vow as much to himself as to her. "We find a place no one knows, a valley, maybe with a river and good earth, where the sun rises clean and the past can't follow. We build a life, one we choose, one we fight for." She smiled, faint but real, the first true smile since Marcus's death, bright as dawn, warm as the fire between them. "Think the world will let us?" she asked, her voice light but laced with hope. "We'll make it let us," he said, his voice a vow, his eyes meeting hers, steady and true. Their hands touched, fingers lacing together, warm and sure, a bond forged in blood and fire, now glowing with the promise of something new. Above, stars blinked awake, cold and brilliant in the velvet sky, their light a map to a future uncharted. Thomas looked up, his voice barely audible, raw with truth, a confession to the night. "This land taught me to kill, to survive, to carry my ghosts. You taught me to live, to hope, to believe there's something worth fighting for beyond the next dawn." Annabelle squeezed his hand, her heart lighter than it had been in years, the shadow of Marcus's death fading, replaced by a promise of tomorrow, a life where she could be more than her vengeance, more than her pain. In the ruins of Iron Hollow, a town that had known only fire and loss, something new took root, a bond forged in blood and vengeance, now blooming into a future unburdened by the past, a love born in the ashes, fragile but fierce, ready to grow. If this story thrilled you, like and subscribe for more epic tales that keep you on the edge of your seat.